Ethan went out for a routine evening run to clear his head, and ended up being hunted by something that should have been terrified of him. At first, he thought the frantic patter behind him was a dog, maybe a squirrel. But when he finally turned around, a starving bobcat kitten, no bigger than his 2 fists, slammed into his shoe, clung to him, and refused to let go. In front of laughing strangers, this wild baby quite literally chose him. Ethan did what any animal lover thinks they'd do. He scooped the kitten up, brought him home, named him Bobby, and promised to keep him safe bottle feedings at 2 a.m. Tiny pores on his chest, Bobcat sleeping in a cardboard box. His quiet, structured life was suddenly full of claws, chaos, and unexpected joy. But as Bobby grew stronger, Ethan uncovered a gut-wrenching truth about raising a wild predator in an apartment, and realized the greatest act of love might mean breaking his own heart. The late afternoon sun of a crisp October day cast long, distorted shadows across the paved running trail that snaked through Meadow Creek Park. For Ethan Miller, this path was more than just asphalt and painted lines. It was a sanctuary, a 10-kilometer loop of rhythmic meditation where the worries of his world dissolved with each synchronized pump of his arms and legs. At 32, Ethan was a man wound tight. His job as a software engineer demanded a level of meticulous brain-draining focus that left his mind buzzing with stray code and unresolved algorithms long after he'd logged off for the day. Running was his release valve, the one place where the digital noise faded into the simple analog reality of his own breathing and the steady thud of his running shoes against the ground. He was on the home stretch, the digital display on his watch flashing 8.12 kilometers. Just under 2 kilometers left, he muttered, his breath coming in controlled, misty puffs in the cool air. He leaned into the familiar burn in his thighs, the sweat a cool sheen on his forehead, darkening the collar of his gray-textured. The park, a sprawling expanse of manicured lawns, old-growth oaks, and wild, untamed meadows on the outskirts of a sleepy Northern California town, was alive with the gentle hum of early evening. A family picnicked under a sycamore, their laughter carrying on the breeze. An elderly couple strolled hand in hand, their golden retrievers sniffing intently at a squirrel's frantic path up a tree. It was a portrait of serene suburban life. That's when he first heard it. A sound so subtle it barely registered against the swish-swish of his own strides. It was a soft, impossibly rapid patter of footfalls, a frantic little rhythm trying to sync up with his own. Ethan, lost in his runner's trance, dismissed it. A squirrel, he thought, or a jackrabbit. The trail was notorious for them. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on maintaining his pace, his gaze fixed on the point where the trail curved out of sight. But the sound persisted, growing marginally louder, more distinct. It wasn't the light, skittering sound of a squirrel. It was heavier, more deliberate, a tiny but determined pursuit. Up ahead, the cluster of people he'd noticed earlier, a group of 3 women in brightly colored yoga pants deep in conversation, suddenly stopped. They turned as one, their chatter ceasing, their bodies freezing in a tableau of shared surprise. One of them pointed directly behind him. "Oh my gosh, look!" Her voice, sharp with amusement, cut through the air. "Wait, what is that?" another asked, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a giggle. A prickle of unease ran down Ethan's spine. He wasn't a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. He risked a quick, over-the-shoulder glance, expecting to see a loose terrier or perhaps an overeager chihuahua that had escaped its owner. What he saw made his brain momentarily short-circuit. Chasing him, with a look of ferocious, unyielding determination etched onto its tiny face, was a bobcat kitten. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, a fluffy, scruffy ball of spotted fur no bigger than his two fists put together. Its ears, tipped with the characteristic black tufts, were pinned back like a fighter jet's wings. Its stubby little tail, barely a bob, was arched in a comical display of aggression, and its oversized paws churned with a desperate galloping motion. Its mouth was open in a silent, panting meow, its tiny pink tongue visible. It was the most absurdly adorable predator he had ever seen. For a heartbeat, Ethan's mind refused to process the image. A bobcat. A wild bobcat. Chasing him. The disconnect between the word bobcat and the ridiculously cute creature pounding the pavement behind him was staggering. His first instinct was a jolt of primal fear. Where there's a kitten, there's a mother. He scanned the tree line, the tall grasses of the meadow, his heart rate spiking for a reason entirely unrelated to cardiovascular exercise. He saw nothing. No sleek, muscular feline shape lurking in the shadows. Just the setting sun painting the landscape in hues of gold and orange. His panic quickly morphed into bewildered amusement as the women by the trail erupted in laughter. It wasn't mocking laughter, but pure, unadulterated delight at the sheer spectacle of it all. "You've got a wild cardio partner," one of them shouted, pulling out her phone to record the scene. "Don't you let that baby cat outrun you." Another cheered, her voice shaking with mirth. Ethan's face flushed. He was a man who lived a quiet, ordered life. His apartment was minimalist, his social circle small, his routine sacred. Being chased by a miniature wildcat while being cheered on by an audience of strangers was not part of any known algorithm. He tried to speed up, a half-hearted attempt to create some distance. But the kitten, fueled by some mysterious primal instinct, simply dug deeper. Its little legs became a blur, its focus absolute. It was gaining on him. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. Here he was, a grown man, being relentlessly pursued by something that looked like it should be on a greeting card. He could hear more people stopping now, the ripples of laughter spreading along the trail. The scene was utterly surreal. The kitten never faltered, never broke stride. With each powerful bound of its hind legs, it closed the gap until Ethan could hear its frantic, wheezing breaths. Finally, with one last heroic burst of speed, the tiny bobcat barreled forward and collided with the back of Ethan's running shoe. The impact was negligible, a soft, furry thud. But it was enough to break the spell. Ethan slowed to a halt, turning to face his pursuer. The kitten stood its ground, planting its front paws firmly against his shoes as if claiming a prize. Its entire body trembled, its small chest heaving with exhaustion. It looked up at him with wide, golden eyes that seemed far too large for its face. Eyes that held not malice, but a desperate, pleading exhaustion. It let out a tiny, raspy mewl that was heart-wrenching. The onlookers howled with laughter, the sight of the triumphant, exhausted kitten and the baffled, sweat-drenched runner too much to handle. "I think you've been chosen," someone called out. Ethan's runner's high had completely evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of responsibility. He crouched down, his knees protesting the sudden stop. The kitten didn't flinch. It just stared up at him, its body quivering. Gently he reached out a hand, half expecting a hiss or a swipe of tiny claws. Instead, the kitten took a wobbly step forward and nudged its head against his fingers, its fur surprisingly soft. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of this bizarre new reality, he scooped the tiny animal into his arms. The kitten didn't resist. It was shockingly light, a fragile collection of bone and fluff. As soon as it was against the warmth of Ethan's chest, it went limp, pressing its face into the fabric of his shirt, its trembling slowly subsiding into a faint rhythmic purr that vibrated through his own body. He stood up, holding the warm bundle against him, feeling its fragile heartbeat against his palm. He scanned the meadows one last time, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The sun was dipping lower, the shadows deepening. There was no sign of a mother bobcat, no frantic calls, no angry glowing eyes in the dusk. This tiny, tenacious creature was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "Okay, little guy," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to the kitten. "Looks like you're coming with me." Cradling his new companion, he turned and began the slow walk back to his car, the remaining 2 kilometers of his run completely forgotten, the laughter of the onlookers fading behind him. He had started his run to clear his head, and now it was filled with a single overwhelming question. What in the world do you do with a baby bobcat? Back in the sterile, quiet environment of his small second-floor apartment, the sheer wildness of the creature in his arms felt magnified. The space, usually a testament to order and control with its clean lines, minimalist furniture, and neatly stacked books, was suddenly invaded by the untamed spirit of the wilderness, currently embodied by a snoozing ball of fur. Ethan laid out an old, soft blanket in a cardboard box, creating a makeshift den. He gently placed the kitten inside. It barely stirred, simply curling into a tighter ball, tucking its nose under its stubby tail. Its exhaustion was profound. But Ethan knew exhaustion wasn't the only issue. The kitten was skinny. He could feel the sharp ridges of its spine and ribs when he'd held it. It needed food, and not the kind he had in his refrigerator. A quick, frantic search on his phone confirmed his suspicions. Cow's milk was a definite no-go. He needed kitten milk replacer, and he needed it now. Leaving the bobcat kitten sleeping soundly, he drove to the nearest 24-hour pet supply store. The fluorescent lights and brightly colored aisles of squeaky toys and gourmet pet food feeling like another dimension compared to the primal drama that had unfolded in the park. He felt conspicuous and slightly fraudulent as he purchased the formula and a set of tiny feeding bottles, rehearsing a plausible lie about a stray domestic kitten in his head, though no one asked. He decided on a name during the drive home. Bobby. It felt simple, unpretentious, and somehow fitting for the determined little creature. The first feeding was a clumsy, delicate affair. Ethan carefully mixed the formula, testing the temperature on his wrist just as the instructions advised. He gently roused Bobby, who blinked at him with those enormous, soul-piercing golden eyes. Propping the kitten up with one hand, he offered the bottle with the other. Bobby initially resisted, turning his head away, his instincts wary. But hunger was a powerful motivator. After a few coaxing nudges, he latched on, and the soft, rhythmic suckling was the most reassuring sound Ethan had ever heard. For the next 2 days, Ethan's meticulously structured life was completely upended. His work-from-home schedule now revolved around 2-hour feeding intervals. His coding sessions were punctuated by the need to mix formula and gently clean Bobby's face with a warm, damp cloth. He'd sit on the floor beside the cardboard box, watching the kitten sleep, marveling at the perfect miniature details. The tiny black tufts on his ears, the way his paws would twitch as he dreamed, the faint, sweet, musky scent of him. Bobby, for his part, was a model houseguest. When he wasn't eating or sleeping, his strength began to return in small bursts. He took a few wobbly steps out of his box, exploring the foreign landscape of Ethan's living room rug with a comical, crouched posture. He discovered the joy of pouncing on a dust bunny, a flash of his predatory future in a harmless, fluffy form. He'd bat at Ethan's shoelaces, his tiny claws barely making a sound. A bond began to form, silent and profound. Ethan found himself talking to the kitten, narrating his work, explaining the complexities of a stubborn line of code as Bobby blinked slowly from his box. And in the quiet evenings, Bobby would crawl out of his blanket and laboriously climb onto Ethan's chest as he lay on the sofa, curling up directly over his heart and purring with a rumbling intensity that seemed too big for his tiny body. In those moments, Ethan felt a sense of connection, a crack in the lonely, ordered facade of his life that was both terrifying and exhilarating. But beneath the growing affection, a heavy reality was setting in. Ethan was a logical man, a problem solver, and the problem of Bobby was far more complex than a simple rescue. He spent hours online, diving deep into articles about wildlife rehabilitation, bobcat behavior, and state laws regarding wild animals. The words he read were stark and unequivocal. Imprinting, habituation, non-releasable. If Bobby stays, he risks imprinting on humans. He read aloud from a wildlife conservation website, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He will associate people with food and safety, losing the natural fear essential for his survival. The best chance for him, the only chance, is specialized rehabilitation. He looked over at Bobby, who was now awake and weakly pawing at a plush fish toy Ethan had bought him. The kitten attacked the toy with a fierce, albeit clumsy determination that was a pale imitation of the skills he would need to survive in the wild. He wouldn't learn to hunt from a plush toy. He wouldn't learn to identify threats or find shelter from Ethan's minimalist apartment. He needed to learn how to be a bobcat, and that was a lesson Ethan was completely unqualified to teach. The decision was agonizing. Every instinct screamed at him to protect this fragile creature, to keep him safe in this warm, comfortable world he could provide. The thought of handing him over to strangers, of leaving him in a cage, was gut-wrenching. It felt like a betrayal. But the logical part of his brain, the part that solved complex problems for a living, knew that keeping him would be the ultimate act of selfishness. It would condemn Bobby to a life in captivity, a shadow of the wild, magnificent animal he was born to be. True kindness, he realized with a heavy heart, meant letting him go. He sat in the silence of his apartment for a long time, the glow of his monitor illuminating his troubled face. He watched Bobby finally conquer the plush fish, dragging it triumphantly back to his cardboard box. In a few months, if all went well, Bobby would run again. This time, not after a bewildered jogger, but into the vast, unforgiving wilderness where he truly belonged. The thought was both heartbreaking and beautiful. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Northern California Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The drive to the rehab center the next morning was quiet and heavy. Bobby sat in a carrier on the passenger seat, occasionally letting out a soft, questioning meow. Ethan reached over and poked a finger through the grate, and Bobby immediately rubbed against it, purring. Each rumble felt like a tiny accusation. The center was located on a large wooded property, a collection of low-slung buildings and sprawling outdoor enclosures. It smelled of pine needles, disinfectant, and wildness. A kind, weathered woman in her 50s named Maria, the center's director, met him at the door. Her eyes were warm and understanding, and she listened patiently as Ethan recounted the entire absurd story of the chase. "You did absolutely the right thing," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she examined Bobby, who had buried his head in the crook of Ethan's arm. "He's dehydrated and underweight, but he's a little fighter. We'll get him checked out by the vet right away." Handing Bobby over was one of the hardest things Ethan had ever done. The kitten seemed to sense the finality of the moment, clinging to his shirt, his tiny claws pricking his skin. As Maria took him, Bobby looked back at Ethan, his golden eyes wide with confusion. The door to the intake room closed, and Ethan was left standing in the lobby, the silence of his empty arms deafening. Maria explained the process. Bobby would undergo a full veterinary check. Once stable, he would be placed in a semi-wild enclosure with another bobcat kitten they had recently rescued. There, climbing logs, natural vegetation, and carefully controlled live prey training would coax his dormant instincts back to the surface. Human contact would be kept to an absolute minimum to prevent habituation. Can I visit him?" Ethan asked, the words catching in his throat. Maria smiled. "We don't usually allow it, to help them deassociate from humans. But given the circumstances, you can come and watch from the observation blind. He won't see you, but you can see him. Every day, if you like." And so, a new routine was born. Every single day after work, Ethan would make the 45-minute drive to the center. He'd sit in the small, camouflaged blind, a cramped wooden box with a narrow slit of one-way glass, and watch. For the first week, it was torture. Bobby was small and scared, often hiding in the hollow log in his enclosure. He was tentative with the other kitten, a slightly larger female they'd named Sky. But under the expert care of the rehabbers, a change began to occur. Slowly, miraculously, Bobby began to thrive. Ethan watched, a silent, invisible spectator to a secret, wild world. He saw Bobby's first successful pounce on a live mouse released into the enclosure. He felt a surge of pride so fierce it surprised him. He watched Bobby and Sky engage in rough and tumble play, stalking and ambushing each other through the tall grass, their movements becoming more fluid, more confident, more lethal with each passing day. He watched as Bobby learned to climb, scaling a fallen tree with an agility that spoke of generations of wild ancestors. He was growing fast, his lanky kitten body filling out with lean muscle. His coat grew thicker, the spots more defined. The goofy, determined kitten who had chased him down a running trail was transforming before his very eyes into a sleek, efficient predator. His daily visits became the anchor of his life. He saw less of his friends. His apartment felt emptier than ever. But sitting in that blind, watching Bobby become the animal he was meant to be, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't realized was missing. He saw the rehabbers, distant figures in khaki, moving with quiet efficiency, their respect for the animals palpable. He and Maria developed a quiet friendship, her brief updates on Bobby's progress. "He brought down a quail today. He's getting very territorial about his favorite sunning spot," were the highlights of Ethan's day. There were heartbreaking moments, too. Days when Bobby would look towards the observation blind, a flicker of something. Recognition? Memory? In his eyes. Before Sky would tackle him, and the wildness would take over again. In those moments, Ethan felt the pang of his loss keenly. The bond was still there, a thin, invisible thread, but it was being stretched, tested, and purposefully frayed by the forces of nature and necessity. He was losing the affectionate, purring companion he had known, and in his place was a creature of instinct and shadow. And he knew, with a certainty that was both painful and right, that this was the goal. This was the victory. 4 months passed. Winter gave way to a wet, vibrant spring. Bobby was now nearly full-grown, a magnificent young bobcat, virtually indistinguishable from a wild one. The time was coming. Maria met him by his car one evening in early March. "He's ready, Ethan," she said softly. "He's passed every test. He's strong, he's an expert hunter, and he's wary of humans. He's as ready as he'll ever be." The release was scheduled for 2 days later at a remote, protected wildlife preserve hundreds of miles away, deep in the mountains. Ethan was invited to be there. The final morning was surreal. He drove with the transport team, Bobby and Sky, in separate, secure crates in the back of a truck. The journey was long and silent. When they finally arrived, the air was different. Thin, cold, and smelling of pine and damp earth. This was a place of true wilderness, vast and imposing. They carried Bobby's crate to a clearing overlooking a vast, tree-filled canyon. The world was quiet, the only sounds the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Ethan knelt by the crate. He could see Bobby's golden eyes through the grate, watching him, watchful and wild. There was no recognition there now, only the cautious assessment of a predator. "Goodbye, Bobby," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and rested his hand on the top of the crate. "Be safe out there, little guy. Go be a cat." The rehabber unlatched the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Bobby remained crouched in the back of the crate. Then, with a fluid, explosive movement, he launched himself out and into the open. He landed silently on the forest floor, his body low to the ground. He stood there for a long moment, a perfect statue of wild potential. He took a breath, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air, taking in the million new smells of his freedom. He turned his head and looked back, not at the humans, but in their general direction. His gaze swept over Ethan, pausing for a fraction of a second. Ethan's heart stopped. In that fleeting moment, in the depths of those wild, golden eyes, he thought he saw it. A flicker, a ghost of a memory, a faint echo of a purring kitten on a warm chest. And then it was gone. Bobby turned, and with a powerful, graceful leap, he was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest without a sound. Ethan stood watching the spot where he had vanished, tears streaming freely down his face. They weren't tears of sadness, not entirely. They were tears of pride, of loss, of a profound and beautiful closure. He had started a run to reset his restless mind and had ended up on the journey of a lifetime. He had held a piece of the wild in his arms, and he had been strong enough and loved it enough to give it back. The hole Bobby left in his life was immense, but the gift he had been given was immeasurable. As he turned to walk back to the truck, Ethan Miller knew he would never be the same. He had been chosen, just for a little while, by a wild cardio partner with a will of iron and a heart full of wilderness. And it had changed everything.